Todd Haynes, your new film Wonderstruck is very different from anything you've ever done before, and yet it holds a lot of similar themes that you've explored in your work. Can you talk a little bit about what attracted you to Brian Selznick's story?
The story was so, unlike anything I've encountered, and not that I read a ton of young adult novels or things like that, but I just found this beautiful concept of paralleling these two stories of kids who both don't have hearing, journeying through New York City 50 years apart and intercutting between the two. Compelling because basically the film is a mystery, and it follows the structure of a cool mystery story, but the mystery keeps getting restated every time you cut between the two, because the question is asked, why are these two stories being shared by one film? What are the reasons linking them? And we know, but like most mystery stories, that these questions are going to get answered, but you kind of have that tension and that thrill of having it be postponed, or one thing is answered but it poses another question, and then the narrative takes a detour and you follow it to the next point. So it had real cohesion while being something also kind of lyrical and cinematic.
What also deals with outsiders, which you generally deal with in your films. I guess all of your films really are about people who are isolated or outcast because of various reasons, be it their sexuality, their gender, or their race. And in this case, it's about people who are in ways handicapped. So, I mean, was that part of the attraction to it for you, this story of outsiders?
It definitely was. I liked the loneliness both kids shared, and the ways that their sort of creative interests and hobbies and curiosities were also things that were going to help them figure out their way and give them a sort of way of telling their own, method for telling their own stories and finding out the answers to these questions. But I also, and because it's a movie that doesn't rely on spoken dialogue, unlike most movies, to the degree that it doesn't, it meant that everything had to rely on the visual language of cinema, and music and cinematography and performances that were about gesture and faces and looks and all these things. And if all those things could work together, you could be compelled emotionally through the story without dialogue steering you. But I also think like kids have limited abilities, and kids have limited freedoms, and they get that. They kind of have an innate understanding of what this might be like, and I think a curiosity about what these kids might be going through.
Let's talk a little bit about the visual storytelling of the movie, because as you mentioned, I mean, there is very little dialogue. I think there's like a good hour-long section right in the middle of the movie where there's no dialogue at all. So it really forces you as a filmmaker to rely upon visual storytelling. Talk a bit about how you were able to do that.
Well, we have these two incredibly rich and seemingly antithetical moments in the history of New York. 1927, where everything is sort of in an economic, optimistic sense of growth and possibility, right before, the crash of '29. And then 1977, a period where the city is in virtual bankruptcy and the city seems to be full of chaos. So we have those contrasts, which were incredibly rich and stimulating things to try to convey visually, and to look back at silent film as a way of talking about the 1920s experience, and looking at the great, urban American films of the 70s for insights into how to visualize the grittiness of that period. But it also called on, because of the lack of dialogue, music and sound design, and ultimately the editing. I think it's really a film in which I learned so much with my editor, Afonso Gonçalves, about how the shape of it would flow, how long you really needed to stay in one story, gain attachments to it emotionally before you were really ready to switch and excited to switch, but then ready to come back again. And that was a process of learning that we went through in the cutting of the film, showing various cuts to kids who we would bring in, hearing their reactions. That was really a cool part of the process. We learned so much from how specific their comments were.
You mentioned looking at silent movies, and in the 1920s segment, it allows you to recreate those kind of silent movie techniques. I mean, I like to think of things like sort of some of the backgrounds that you use, some of the lighting that you use. Can you talk a little bit about recreating those silent movie techniques for this movie? And well, the one thing you don't use is title cards, but other than that, recreating those silent movie techniques.
Well, the thing about silent film, especially at this period, 1927, like right before silent cinema ended and sound was introduced, is you're really talking about movies at one of their most sophisticated and diverse moments. So there was almost every kind of movie already being made, and very different stylistic languages from country to country to country. So there are moments in Wonderstruck where Rose is hiding from the guards in the Museum of Natural History, and there's almost a German expressionist kind of flavor to the shadows on the walls and the sense of escape. There's also a sense of the kind of beautiful naturalism that you can see in a movie like The Crowd by King Vidor, that was shot in New York City in 1928 on the streets of New York City, but also has from Billy Wilder's The Apartment. Billy Wilder just lifted it from the crowd, that magnificent crane shot that looms down over a sea of desks and finds the lone worker, in a Kafkaesque little grid of desks that we also do a little homage to in the miniature section at the end of the film when the backstory is finally told.
Can you talk a little bit about that miniature section of the film? I mean, it's really, it harkens back to your first big film, the Karen Carpenter story. Can you talk a little bit about where the idea for that came from?
Yeah, this is the end of the film without giving too much away. It's where the backstory, the story that really the little boy in the 70s is seeking to answer a lot of his questions, finally receives, but he's reading it from the character who has written it all down. And we wanted it to have a different, flavor and style to the rest of the movie, because it's also something that this 12-year-old kid is envisioning as he reads it. And so really it didn't take much for me and Mark Friedberg, the production designer, to think about the language that was already been established in the story, the world of the diorama and Natural History Museum, and the one key diorama, the wolf diorama, something that has haunted this little boy throughout his life, and we find out why through the course of the film. But the diorama is like a little miniature, or like a little narrative. It's like a little three-dimensional space that encapsulates the life of a species, of a certain species. And here, Ben has actually landed in the panorama, the miniature scale model of New York City. So it kind of combines the miniatures of the New York City scale model with all of these are three-dimensional reenactments of space with the diorama. And so all of these little stories are told as little tableaus. They're actually not stop motion. We did them with motion control cameras that go very, very slowly, and we move the puppets sort of quickly in the frame, so they have a kind of jerkiness that feels naive. It feels like it comes out of the imagination of a kid. And all of a sudden, I can't remember exactly what point I thought, oh yeah, this is like Superstar. This is what I was doing with dolls at the very beginning of my film career.
Right. Speaking of the children, I mean, you have three really great child actors at the center of this film. There's different schools of thought in how you direct children. What was your approach to it?
Well, the biggest challenge was in the role of Rose, the girl in 1927 who's 12 in the story, who's deaf, who's born deaf in the story. And I wanted to try to find a deaf kid to play the part. That was already going to be a risk because it would mean we'd basically be casting a kid who's never acted before. There's not a big community of professional deaf actors at that age. So we sort of did a little search through the country and solicited for kids to come and do self-made tapes. We found this unbelievable kid, Millicent Simmonds, who lives outside Salt Lake City, Utah, who'd never acted before. So, and who was deaf, and so her translator became an integral part of the process on set. And yet, I have to say that really working with kids is like, you know, working with any actor. It's all about casting. It's all about finding the right sort of chemistry and the combination. And then they're like anybody else. And if you treat kids with the respect that you would an adult actor, a professional adult actor, I think they respond in kind, and they come with the same sort of seriousness and professionalism and respect for what we're all trying to do together that any professional adult would. And that was really my experience with these kids. Oates Fegley who plays Ben, had worked and played the lead in Pete's Dragon. And Jaden Michael also had some professional experience. But these were really, really smart, articulate kids. And Millie was just an exceptional kid who had a sense of the camera in a way that you really can't, render that. That's something innate. So we really lucked out.
You also have Julianne Moore in the film, who's been a frequent collaborator of yours going all the way back to Safe. You also did Far From Heaven, got her an Oscar nomination for that movie. What is that collaboration like between the two of you?
It is like, in many ways, it's like it always was, because Julianne brings her, again, an innate understanding, I think, of the medium of film and how much the camera picks up on nuance and understatement. And, you know, the confidence or something about what to not show, you know, the things she does show as a character and the things she doesn't show as a character. This is the first time I worked with her in it's almost a triple role. She plays a silent movie actress from the 1920s story, and she plays an older woman in the 1930s story, in the 1970s story. But she also plays a scene within a movie in the silent film. And all three roles are non-speaking roles. And so which she'd never done before. But I think, again, she prepares meticulously for whatever she does. She comes with something that's both intuitive and also very well researched. The combination of the two is remarkable. And I think we both have a sense of, I just have intense trust in her. And I think she feels some of that for me. And it makes us feel mutual security, but it means we can sort of both do what we do. I don't have to direct Julianne. She kind of just brings it.
You are, in your work, are often drawn to stories set in the past. I mean, even Safe was set like 10 years before you made the movie. Yeah. So I wonder what draws you to these stories about the past?
I think that I always learn something I learn more about the world. I learn more about movies. I learn more about where we are today and how we got here, maybe, by looking to the past. And I think it's my instinct that the audience might learn some of that as well by holding up that frame and having there be a difference between today and the time that the film is taking place. Making that frame explicit, which is what period films do. And this film, more than any other, because it has a double frame and it's contrasting two periods, you kind of have to keep unpacking. You think the 20s are positive and the 70s are negative until you imagine what it might be like to be a deaf person in either of those eras. And you realize, actually, you know, the 20s, they didn't know what to do with a deaf kid. They weren't teaching sign language to deaf kids in the 1920s. It was not favored. They were trying to teach them how to speak. And in the 1970s, deaf culture had finally refound itself, and it gave people like Rose a place to be and a way to live. So it asked you to keep looking beyond the surface of these periods and you know, learning things in the process, hopefully.
Well, that was certainly the case with Far From Heaven, which brought you an Oscar nomination. What did that kind of recognition mean for you for that film?
Well, I feel I mean, that was an amazing, honor and privilege. I also felt like it was the last film that Elmer Bernstein ever did a score to, and we developed a close friendship during Far From Heaven. But for me, it was basically affirming a kind of discredited genre, the melodrama, the maternal melodrama, that people sort of look down upon. And I felt like this farm had a lot of potential to describe and domestic conflicts. And all of a sudden I felt like, wow, this is connecting to a contemporary audience. That was incredibly gratifying to see that the film really could reach from its source, the 1950s melodrama, and connect to a contemporary audience at that time. That meant a lot to me.
Well, it's certainly a film that, for me personally, and I'm sure that for a lot of people, continues to gain as each year goes by and each viewing goes on. So I hope that means something to you.
Nice.
You're welcome. I know you've got to go, but I wanted to know, what are you working on next? Do you have anything in the pipeline?
I have a few things in the pipelines, not ready to describe them all. I did announce this very cool project, a documentary about the Velvet Underground that I'm going to try to work into the schedule of feature filmmaking that I'm developing. But I've never done a doc before, and this is an extraordinary, influential band whose lack of visibility. There's no documentation on the Velvet Underground virtually. There's little bits of pieces from Warhol films that most of us have seen. So it's going to be a challenge to how to describe that film visually and to really get into that period through archival stuff and rekindle what was going on in the avant-garde in the 60s that produced this band in that time. So it'll be great. I'm excited about the process. It'll be a new one for me.
Well, it certainly fits into your wheelhouse already. I mean, you've always had a great affinity for music in your films, like in this one particularly, or in Velvet Goldmine, for instance. So, I mean, there's that sort of love of music throughout your work that fits into this.
Yes, that has definitely been a driving force, and a fascination with certain kinds of artists that defy categorization or expand what our ideas about the role of the musician is, and the fact that they can occupy multiple selves at once, like the Dylan biography tried to demonstrate.
Right, I was going to say, yeah, I'm not there also, the Bob Dylan movie.
Exactly. Yeah. 7 Bob Dylans in one movie.
Right. Well, Todd Haynes, thank you so much, and congratulations.
Thank you.
On the film.
Thanks so much. Take care.
You too. Have a good one.